In 1972, all of the incoming members of the armed services have been volunteers. From the very beginning, critics of the plan claimed that the all-volunteer force was inadequate, unable to do the job. Although military leaders insisted we were not in trouble. But the criticism has continued, and last week, a Harris poll showed that a majority of Americans now feel that we should return to compulsory military service. So on Face-Off this morning, we are asking, should we reinstate the military draft? Robin Beard is Republican congressman from Tennessee. He says yes. Major General Robert Solomon is Chief of Public Affairs for the United States Army. He says no, and both the congressman and General Solomon are in our Washington studios this morning. Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome. Long distance.
Good morning, Sandy.
Congressman, let's start with you. Why do you think we should reinstitute the draft now?
Well, first of all, let me just say real quickly, you know, the Army and the different branches of military had the all-volunteer Army crammed down their throat by a bunch of politicians, and they've been trying to make it work for 6 years, and they've, I think, done a fairly good job considering the circumstances. But the statistics and the figures now show that we are not receiving a return on our dollar. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars just trying to get bodies into the military, and the quality of bodies that we're getting in the military just is not adequate to run probably one of the most sophisticated weapon systems that have been developed by our armed services. Numbers, we are drastically in trouble in numbers. When we talk about mobilization, when we talk about an outbreak of hostilities, we have to ask the question, do we have the wherewithal to go and face the enemy? And by the Army's own figures, it shows that we have critical problems. You hear many times they say, well, the active all-duty Army is working. But you just can't look at the active all-duty Army. You have to look at the fact that in our individual ready reserve, we've gone from 900,000 men to less than 100,000 men in the past 4 years. You've got to look at the fact that we would be over 500,000 men short by the Army's own admission in case of an outbreak of hostilities. Within 60 days, we'd be over 500,000 men short if we had war in the NATO scenario. And so right down the wire, all the facts and figures show we are in serious trouble.
General, do we have the numbers and the quality of people to aid us, to keep our security?
It depends whether we're talking about the active Army, Sandy, or whether we're talking about the total Army, which includes the individual ready reserve and the selected reserve, which means the United States Army Reserve and the National Guard, Army National Guard. With regard to the active Army, the Congressman has stated that for the past 5.5 years, we have brought in the necessary quantity. We differ on the issue of quality. We believe that we have adequate quality and that the young men and women who are in the Army today are performing well. When you talk about a protracted conflict, that means a war of some length. It is at that point that I believe we concur that there is a need for some type of a selective service system in a much more active status than the one that we have today.
Mm-hmm. Let us deal with, there have been so many scandals here recently about recruiting, or recruiters, I should say, meeting the quotas needed for the military, the fraudulent practices that they indeed have been using. And even with those practices, though, the Army in particular fell like 2% below its recruiting goal. So if it is that difficult to find volunteers, why don't we bring back the draft?
The end strength of the Army today is 99+% what it was intended to be at the end of the fiscal year. And I think, all things considered, that's an excellent record. The Army today is capable of, the active Army is capable of doing its job. Again, when we talk about the possibility of the need for a selective service system, I think we're directly referring to a protracted conflict and the need to beef up the reserve components and the IRR, the filler personnel that would be necessary in case of mobilization. With regard to the malpractice, the fact is we investigate every claim of malpractice. And when you consider the fact that we have over 5,000 recruiters in the field, that we brought in excess of 130,000 people last year, we found out that I believe there were some 97 substantiated cases of malpractice. That's a rather small percentage overall.
Sandy, I think it's only fair to point out, though, the General stated that the active duty Army is capable of doing its job. That's really, I don't think, an accurate picture, because the active duty forces, in many cases, are totally dependent and can't move without an effective, well-trained reserve force. And so the active duty Army cannot do its job without a good, healthy reserve force, and we don't have a healthy reserve force. We're dying on the vine. We talk about recruitment practices. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Our top NCOs, our top officers are out in the recruiting field. They're talking about free college education, of which 90% of the young men are not able to get their college education in the military. We're talking about free medical care, which is a critical problem. We're painting a picture of 30-day paid vacation, learn a trade, but when they go into the Army, they find there are things like having to clean latrines and sitting in a foxhole in 20-degree weather. And as a result of this, up to 40% of all the young people joining the Army today do not complete their first tour of duty. Now, I think that's a tragedy. I think also we need to point out, we talk about quality of the young people coming in. The Army, while talking about we're getting more high school graduates...
We have about 30 seconds, let me say. Go ahead.
They aren't mentioning the fact they've had to establish reading schools. They're not mentioning the fact that they're rewriting the training manuals, downgrading the reading level from the 11th grade to the 8th grade. They're not mentioning the fact that the Class 3 mental categories has gone from 32% to 49% in the past 4 years.
Congressman, let's let the general go.
Yeah. But, of course, what the congressman is doing is taking the problems of education in society and trying to transform that problem to the military. The fact is that society may not be able to solve the reading problem, but the Army can through the basic skills education program.
Thank you.